open meeting, so we also want to welcome the public, any of the public who may be attending. We have one agenda item today, which is the performance audit, which is required every 3 years. And it's been conducted by Moss Adams, and we're going to be hearing from Tammy and Colleen. But first, could you call the roll, please?
Tim Barrett,
Present.
Dan Bernal,
Present.
George Blumenthal, Maria Bonneville,
Present.
Joyce Saki,
Present.
Anne-Marie Duliege,
Present.
Elena Flowers, Judy Gasson,
Here.
Vitam Bassiani,
Here.
Steve Julesgard,
Present.
Pat Levitt.
Here.
Okay, and we have quorum.
Okay, I think we're ready to begin the presentation from Moss Adams.
All right, I will get started. Tammy's going to join us in just a little bit. Hi, everyone. I'm Colleen Rosillos. I'm a partner with Moss Adams. I have had the privilege of working with you all for quite a few performance audits over the last several years, and I was the engagement partner for this performance audit. And we conduct this performance audit as required by your enabling bond measure every 3 years. The purpose of the audit is to look at, I would say, kind of two major things. Did we do what we said we would with public funds? So we're thinking about all of the ways that we expend dollars, what the measure requires us to do in terms of grants, loans, intellectual property, legalities, all sorts of fun things related to compliance. And then we look at your internal controls. We look at your policies and procedures, and we test those to make sure that you're doing things in accordance with best practice. And then finally, what I think is the fun part of a performance audit, we look at everything else. Under government auditing standards, we look at economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of governance, of management, of operations, because ultimately we're accountable to the public, and we want to be able to say we're doing things as efficiently and effectively as possible. Our organizational and operational effectiveness directly leads to us better serving CIRM's mission. So this performance audit had those three major areas of focus: compliance, controls, efficiency, and effectiveness. And to perform this, we have a prescribed methodology that is part of government auditing standards. So we conducted interviews with essentially everyone in management across CIRM, as well as some folks who are in really important roles, things like grants and legal, that we wanted to make sure that we really understood processes. We also interviewed quite a wide cross-section of the board, including all of the committee chairs, folks who had been on the ICOC for a long time, folks who were brand new, to get a sense of how governance operated, and if you had the information you needed to be able to make strong decisions. We reviewed tons and tons of documents like policies and procedures, regular reports, other materials, so that we could understand how you operated. And then we did process walkthroughs with CIRM staff for systems for all of your core functions to see how those operated and make sure we could compare them with best practice. We also sampled and tested 25 grants, 20 grant applications, and reviews, and 35 contracts, so that we could look at compliance with policies and procedures, the integrity of your core functions, alignment with awards, with Proposition 14 provisions, with federal and state requirements, the whole shebang. So first up, I'm going to give you a couple of commendations. I think first and foremost, which we'll cover a little bit later and actually didn't put on this slide, I just want to say you didn't have any compliance findings in this performance audit, and that's really great because a lot of dollars come in and out of CIRM every year, and you had no challenges in terms of compliance with any of the regulations in Proposition 14 or any other state or federal regulations around how you do your work. So I think that's a really great takeaway for you all, that staff is doing what they need to do with respect to compliance. We also noted that you've got some really resilient employees and you have so many folks who stick around because of the mission of CIRM and do an incredible job every day to help to deliver on CIRM's mission. We work with government employees almost exclusively, and so we get to see folks kind of at different levels of mission engagement, and you absolutely are in that, top 10% there, which is fantastic. Over the past 3 years, CIRM has really invested in project management and operations management in order to actually deliver on the mission more effectively. And we noticed that compared to 3 years ago. We also noticed a real enhancement in those grants management practices, which led to no compliance findings. Recently, CIRM restructured internal services to have greater alignment and focus on internal services. So when I say that, I'm thinking about sort of HR, legal, finance, IT, much better alignment there. That's really the engine that drives any entity. And so having an effective engine helps us to serve the agency more effectively and helps us to ultimately deliver on our mission more effectively. The agency's new emphasis on DEI has also been really noted, and it's something that staff has dedicated a lot of time to. A lot of policies and procedures have been identified, really enhanced practices, not just because of access and affordability as required by the proposition, but also in addition to that, just really thinking about how do we do our work and can we do it in a more equitable manner. And then we've noticed that there has been also some investment, particularly around the adoption of a system called adaptive planning that helps us to make more data-driven decisions and better operational reporting to management and ultimately to you all. That pays huge dividends, and so we're very impressed by the addition of that. So now I'll get to our findings. We had 13 findings, again, no compliance findings in those strong grants management practices. But our themes kind of overall, so your team is really dedicated, your team is resilient, your team has rolled with a lot of punches, especially when we think about kind of the last 5 years, whether or not CIRM was going to continue rolling through the pandemic, figuring out how to operate and kind of expand operations over the last several years. That's something that you will see reflected throughout the performance audit report. We also, a couple of recommendations, I think kind of overall that we saw throughout is the need to update policies and procedures so that we can match the current business processes. Any organization, policies and procedures, you kind of put that on your list for Friday afternoon, and then it gets to Friday at 4 and oops, you didn't update the policies and now it's been 3 years, right? It's time to really take a look at policies and procedures and make sure those are updated, particularly around human resources. We want to make sure that we are in alignment with California public employee regulations as well as state employment law. That's very important for us. And then we have quite a few recommendations around human resources. Our recommendation here ultimately, and you'll see a pretty significant theme, is to make really intentional investments to mature the human resources function. That's things like the people, how we are organized, how many folks we have doing this work, the processes that human resources uses and their policies, as well as the systems that support human resources. So I will get into the findings and recommendations here. We had 2 findings related to leadership. So one is internal and one is really focused on the ICOC. So we noticed as we were going through our work that the CEO has 11 direct reports, and that is a lot of direct reports. During the course of our performance audit, while it wasn't in our audit period, you also experienced CEO turnover, and we know you're doing a search for the next CEO. So as you're searching for the next CEO, think about organizational structure options that reduce the CEO's direct reports to a realistic number. Industry standard for a scientific organization, for an organization as complex as yours, is really thinking about 4 to 6. We have seen maybe up to 8 direct reports, but given the highly external role of the CEO of CIRM, we really recommend fewer direct reports. And as you are going through that search, I know that's going to be a big part of this committee's work, really thinking about who is the person that we end up choosing. what are their strengths? What are their opportunities for other folks to support things? So often we see maybe all internal services are operated underneath maybe a deputy or a chief of staff, or we might see kind of scientific functions separated out under a chief science officer. Those are all organizational options that you could assess as you're going through that process. This is really good timing to do that because you're not necessarily going to move anybody's cheese if you've got an interim in place anyway. And then the second finding is one that we've actually had in quite a few of our performance audits for you. I think the last 3 have had some recommendations around this. You, I'm sure, are very aware you have a very large board. This is unusually large, you're statewide, it's very complex, and the meetings are hybrid. And I always say, like, there's nothing worse than a virtual meeting than a hybrid meeting, right? It can just be really challenging to run meetings in an effective way and feel like people are all fully engaged. While we did not necessarily hear from board members that folks were disengaged or that meeting attendance was low or anything like that, this has to be top of mind, particularly for the chair and vice chair and the governance committee to really think about, are we being as intentional as possible in making sure folks can participate fully and are fully engaged? Over the last several years, you've had some very long tenured board members who have term limited out of the board, and you will have a number of folks, including folks on this committee, who are going to do that in the future. And so making sure that we hold on to that knowledge, making sure that we get really good participation from folks who do replace those long-serving members is very important to the function of the board. So thinking about how we can continue to look at committees, continue to look at working groups, getting folks to understand kind of governance at that committee level is going to be really valuable to you all going forward. Next up, we have our operations finding. So again, we did not have anything related to compliance. We had a couple of recommendations just around sort of better management of contracts and loans and kind of things like that. So with respect to sole source procurements, we didn't have any findings related to compliance, but we did find that there were some system limitations that meant that some of them were miscategorized. And so there are some opportunities to improve how we do contract recording, how we increase transparency in that process. We recommend establishing a process for that. And then in the biannual report, make sure that that's updated, that we have better transparency in that sole source process. Sole source contracts in particular get a lot of public attention. So we want to make sure that all of our I's are dotted, as well as our lowercase j's throughout that process. And then the loan election policy needs to be updated. I mentioned we were going to have a lot of policy and procedure recommendations here. So it's comprehensive, but it should be a little bit more detailed. So we're thinking about we have to update some regulations. We have to make sure that they're reflected. And then LIBOR is noted in that policy. LIBOR went away. And so we've got to make sure that we have updated that or potentially included an alternative benchmark. Our final operations finding is around monitoring of grantee compliance around technology disclosure. These disclosure surveys need to be done on a regular basis. They're done currently ad hoc. And so really thinking about systematizing that will be very important so that you have better reporting of those technology disclosures. Right now, that's really a one-on-one kind of thing. And that might have been easier to do earlier in CIRM's life cycle, but now you've got a lot more folks who are filing those technology disclosures. And so we want to make sure that that is done on a more systematic basis. Within the planning and program development category, we had a few recommendations here. One is around you have some uncertainty around the sustainability of the Patient Assistance Fund. And so we recommend regularly reporting to the board on the patient serve, the cost per patient, so that you can do better data-driven decision-making. You also collect a lot of data that is valuable, not just to you, but is valuable to the whole community that is part of serving patients and advancing CIRM's mission. You currently don't have a data governance structure or any process to help to compile that data. So that's something that will be very important, particularly as we think about CIRM's legacy and what you will leave on the state of California and within the community here, thinking about how we can make sure that this data is controlled, accessible, who has access to it, what do we include, and how will we share that information? That's something that I anticipate an ad hoc committee would likely end up being formed to address. We also noted, particularly around how folks are, delivering on program work, that CIRM has restructured some functions and restructured workloads, but hasn't necessarily taken kind of a full look at who's doing what. Is that work still relevant? Do we have folks who are maybe doing a lot? Could we redistribute workloads? We recommend doing a workload analysis, really trying to look at data, things like doing a time study, looking at what folks are actually doing in terms of output, so that you can understand what staffing needs are, what they might be, and incorporate that into annual operational planning. We're not necessarily saying you should add staff. We're just saying, let's think about right-sizing workloads. And then we wanted to note, and I mentioned this earlier, your change has happened really fast over the last several years, and there has been a little bit of a lack of understanding among staff of what's a priority today, who's responsible for what, and what are we actually doing kind of big picture. So we recommended a couple of things. The first is to adopt a standardized change management template to understand who needs to be informed, who will be impacted by change, and then really creating that culture of deliberate change management. And really that's about communication, making sure everyone who needs to know is informed, that folks are communicated to early and often, that change is actually implemented and there's an accountability measure for that. And that we do have a two-way feedback mechanism between folks in management and staff in terms of how effective those changes are and if we need to make any updates. And then our final section was related to human resources. So first and foremost, most HR processes are manual and most are not documented, and there's not a lot that employees can do to self-service. And so this just frankly slows down the business of CIRM, and it has folks focusing on things that they don't need to focus on. There has been an effort in the past year to really lean into improving human resources. And so that's HR process automation, employee self-service. Bamboo HR is the system that's in place. And so that just needs to be looked at in terms of, can we mature it? Can we get full adoption? What else can we do to make things automated? And then very, very important, document key HR procedures. There's been a lot of turnover in the HR position. It's typically been done by one person. In my experience with you all checking in every 3 years, that person's been different every time. And so not having those procedures documented can put you all at pretty significant risk of the continuity of the function. Again, thinking about your employment law compliance, that's a risk to you all. And so really thinking about making sure that we have that information documented and that it is kept up to date. Next step, we have limited policies. As I mentioned, folks in HR don't have a lot of bandwidth, and there were pretty significant hiring needs as the agency ramped back up after Proposition 14. And so that meant that the hiring process was delayed, and then folks were onboarded pretty inconsistently. And we're seeing a little bit of the ripple effect of that. So not everybody knows everything. There can be some pretty significant knowledge gaps or just communication gaps because that was missed in onboarding. So we recommend putting together standard operating procedures for the hiring and onboarding process, trying to really focus on having a consistent experience for your employees. There is research that says kind of the first 90 days of employment decide whether or not someone is going to stay with you long term. So we want to make sure that that situation is really consistent and good for folks. And then when we need to really differentiate those onboarding plans for folks who have different responsibilities. So obviously people who work in grants are going to be different from people who work in IT, but we want to make sure that we're as consistent as possible and that training is offered frequently and is updated regularly. I have 2 more recommendations for you in HR. So one is that there may have been some pay inequities between kind of older and newer employees. And what you really need to do is look at the compensation policy and make sure that it's updated and consistent with the state employee manual. So we want you to update that policy. And then we also want you to take a look across the organization at pay, make sure that pay bands are consistent, assess for pay inequities across CIRM. As I mentioned in the beginning, CIRM is a place that people work because they love the mission. They don't work at CIRM because of the pay and benefits, which are good, but it's not the main driver. But we also need to make sure that we're doing things fairly and equitably and consistently. And this is, again, a really big impact of not having consistent HR and not having those processes in place. And then finally, current hybrid work policy. So that's definitely a policy that needs to be updated. Hybrid work and remote work are huge in today's employment environment. As a statewide organization, it's also something for you to really think about in terms of where people are working and what they're doing, right? And how much we want folks to be in the office. So we want you to do two things. The first is to look at the impact of your policy on employee productivity. Talk to folks, figure out if you can get any quantitative data around, is this working for us? Are there opportunities for us to improve? We also want to make sure that's applied consistently. When we don't apply employment policies consistently, that opens us up to risk. And we also want to make sure whatever policy you have in place supports your operational goals. And then our second recommendation here is around creating allowable exceptions. And this is probably more work for the management team than it would be for the board, but understanding where we would make exceptions. So whether someone is caring for an ill family member is often a regular exemption. Whether someone is working internationally, those are often in these policies, things like that, so that we can support the policy being consistent, that it is transparent, everyone understands, and no one thinks that it's unfair. And then finally, I have an update on our prior performance audits. So the first two performance audits conducted in 2011 and 2014, all recommendations have been implemented or cleared. For the 2017 performance audit, that is also complete. And during this period, we validated or closed 4 open recommendations. The prior performance audit, which was conducted in 2021, after passage of Proposition 14, we have 1 recommendation that was closed, which means it wasn't implemented, but it's also the time has passed to implement it, so it's not relevant anymore. We're not going to leave that hanging open for you. 3 are complete, and then we have 5 more in progress that we'll check on again in 3 years. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and open it up for any questions or discussion from the committee.
Thank you very much for that report, Colleen. Very, very well done. I have a question that I'm not sure you can answer. What is the best practices around the last point of work from home and hybrid workplaces? Do you have any sense for where things are going or what's working well in other organizations?
That's a great question. If I had the answer to that question, I would probably be writing a New York Times bestseller at the moment instead of here. But, you know, we're seeing kind of 2 things. One is organizations, particularly in the private sector, are saying everybody's coming back because this doesn't feel like it's working for us. And other organizations are staying hybrid. And the differentiator seems to be kind of the tenure and experience of staff. So in our industry, where we have a lot of folks who are fresh out of college, you know, tons and tons of accountants kind of cycle through the system every year, we're seeing a big movement toward being in person because of the training and connection needs. In an organization like CIRM, where you have folks who tend to be pretty experienced when they join you, it's more likely that folks can be productive at home and have experience in a hybrid environment. So it really depends individually what works for you all. I do know that being sort of part-time in the office and having anchor days can be really successful for a lot of our clients.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the committee members?
Yeah, I was going to say there was an article in the Los Angeles Times yesterday about this very topic. And I don't know if anyone saw it. It was in Sunday's Times and LA Times. And they basically parroted what you just said. And in fact, they did surveys, and the younger generation actually said that they prefer to spend more time in office than outside of office, which was a surprise to several of this is private sector that has moved towards having at least 3 in-person days, remaining somewhat hybrid and flexible, but more days in than out.
Thank you, Pat. Maria Bonneville.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for being here today. I really appreciate it. Something that you mentioned about the patient support fund, patient services, just to clarify, So it's not just limited to royalty revenues that come in. We can add to that fund from our own research funding or other funding mechanisms or fundraising that we might do on the side. It is really important to the organization, so I expect that we will explore other avenues to continue this fund and to add to it. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that it's not just royalty funds, but it can be other funding mechanisms that go into that. And it is really important. So thank you for highlighting that. I really appreciate it.
And that's a great point. Our finding wasn't, hey, you might not have enough money. It's that we don't have the data to understand actually what the fiscal longevity of the funds are. And so making sure that you understand the financial health, understand what your options are is really important to actually delivering on that long term.
Great. And, our standards working group is meeting soon to discuss the different support services that we may cover, expanding that program. Currently, right now, it's limited. Can we expand the program and to what we would expand it to? So there is ongoing conversation around that. So thank you.
Steve.
Yes, I want to ask a question about finding number 12. The finding is due to historical compensation practices, pay inequities, now I'm going to highlight the words may have developed between tenure and new employees. So the first question is did you test that potential assumption? Now you tested in the grant area, you actually picked out grants and you tested them to see how we were doing. Did you take a look at, or is this just basically based on employee feedback and how people felt that they were being treated vis-a-vis others? What's the basis for this particular finding?
So both. So we did look at pay, but we also did talk to folks about it. It was absolutely something that came up. And there are a couple of inputs here. So one is that folks who have been at the place where they've worked prior to the pandemic are simply on a different trajectory than people who you hired 2020, 2021, because the market was so tight. Every organization ended up paying a premium for people that they hired during that time. So that's going to create an inequity just on its own. And it's something that's happening across every industry, and people are kind of figuring out, how do we bring people up? The other impact there is historically CIRM has not given cost of living adjustments. So many folks who were hired are still earning the same salary in real dollars that they were earning when they were hired, and not adjusting for inflation, nothing like that. And so that's also going to really impact if you hire someone at a 2023 market rate versus someone who was hired in 2017. If they have the same job, there's going to be a difference. And so those practices were pretty well known. We had noted that in some of our prior performance audits, understanding that that's something that you all did. And so that's why an equity analysis, really understanding folks' jobs and then doing that assessment, is going to be very important to you in longer term.
Did you ask about whether or not CIRM is abiding by the California pay transparency law that came into effect in early 2023, whereby we have to post when we are hire for new positions, the pay ranges for those positions, and any employee who asks what the pay range is for the position that they're in has a right to know that. Did you ask about that? Do we know how well we're doing with regard to paying attention to that particular law?
We did ask about that. So I know that that's something that HR and legal are aware of. But that's also, you're not on a big hiring push like you were before. So it's a little bit harder to test given kind of open positions versus where you all are today. But it's absolutely something that HR is aware of.
And Steve, I can confirm that, yeah, we are complying with the transparency laws.
All right, so I take it that this is where the concerns are about disparate pay is coming from, as people are realizing that the pay ranges have moved on them. I mean, in some sense, I hear what you're saying. This is something that we need to be out in front of, all right? We have an existing employee base that, have a lot of investment in the organization in terms of their experience, et cetera. And we certainly can't be paying new people more than we're paying existing people doing, comparable work. And if at the very least, it should actually probably be the other way around, assuming equal competency. So anyway, for me, it's a bit of a concerning issue. Now, one of the issues, and this is not for you so much, but for the rest of us, is we need, as an organization, management needs to get on top of the HR issues. I just don't think we've done a good enough job of that. I'm not sure what the strength is in our HR group, but I think this is part and parcel of kind of the output of your findings here. Is we've got several things that are touching on the on human resources and their role within an organization. So I note at the very end of your presentation, let me find that real fast here. Then this is not a question for you. It's on the last page. No, it's not on the last page. Where is it? Somewhere along here, it maybe not have been in the presentation. It may have been on the actual materials themselves. Management's response was, "We'll get back to you, the board, down the road," which I don't know how long we've had these findings, et cetera, but one of the things I would like to hear at some point, not from management, is what their plan is for addressing these issues. We need to see a work plan to meet this presentation and to create a hierarchy of importance. Not everything is equally important. Some things are much more critical to deal with more quickly than others. But I'm just sounding this note, and I will probably take it up at the upcoming ICOC meeting. But we need to understand from management what their plan is going forward to address some of these issues.
So Steve, if I may, on behalf of the LT, we are working on a plan, and we plan to present it, I believe, at the February Governance Subcommittee meeting, and then the following ICOC. So we've been in process. It's just not been finalized, and it's not ready for public consumption, if you will. But we are well on the way to working on a lot of these issues, because, to your point, they are important, especially the HR ones, which fall in my bailiwick, if you will. So we're working on those post-haste.
Thank you, Raphael. Thank you.
Okay, great points. Other comments and questions from the members of the committee? I don't see any hands raised. Are there any comments or questions from members of the public?
I do not see any hands raised there either.
Okay, we do not need to have a motion today. I've checked with Scott on that. So if there's nothing further, I want to again thank Colleen and her colleagues at Moss Adams for having done a terrific performance evaluation and a great presentation today. And this has really given us some things to work on going forward and to prioritize. And you can be assured that that's what we're going to do.
Sorry, Judy, it does seem like JT has a comment that he wants to make.
Oh, JT, do you have a comment? I don't see you on there you are. JT?
JT, it's indicated that you're muted.
How's that?
Now we can hear you, JT.
Great, thank you. Well, hello, everybody. Nice to speak to you. I've read the report with great interest. Colleen, thank you very much. As we've said numerous times over the years, we really appreciate all of your input and ability to hone in on issues that can help us to improve. My only comment to the Governance Subcommittee at this point is I've taken due note of all the recommendations, and we'll be systematically working with Raphael and the team to give my input on how we will react to all of this in constructing a plan for the board to review in February. But just wanted to let you know that as a new starting interim CEO, I'm fully aware of all these issues and look forward to working with everybody to address them, correct them, and move on.
Welcome back, JT.
Thank you, Steve.
Great news, JT. We're very happy to hear that. That's terrific.
Thank you, Judy.
Okay. Last call for comments or questions. Otherwise, we will be ready to adjourn this meeting and see you all at the ICOC meeting in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I know you're
Oh,
closing,
Vito?
but
Oh, go ahead, Anne-Marie.
yeah, I just wanted to say, Colleen, it has been a pleasure to work with you over the years. I think now you've been, what, third time at least, probably? And
Six.
I'm sure I'm not the only one. Fourth time. I'm sure I'm not the only one to tell, the pleasure it is to work with you. Not only you're incredibly professional, knowledgeable, and diligent, but you're also very upbeat and positive, which is such an important quality, obviously, in your situation, as you very well know, and you exhibited remarkably well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And I see no other hands raised or comments being made. And so I think we can adjourn this meeting, and I look forward to seeing all of you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Judy.
you.
Thanks,
Happy New
Colleen.
Year. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.